This is Viewpoint.
And thanks for joining us. This is Viewpoint. I'm Joe Paris, filling in for Doug Petcash. In a few weeks, on Tuesday, November 8th, voters across Idaho will head to the polls in the general election to decide on who they want to represent them in key federal, state, and local office. And this week, we are focused on the race for Idaho Attorney General. There's been a lot about this in the news. Today on the show, we'll start with Democrat Tom Arkoosh. The Boise attorney announced back in July that he's running for Idaho Attorney General as the Democratic nominee. Arkoosh will face former U.S. Representative Raul Labrador in the November general election. Labrador, a Tea Party favorite during his 4 terms in the United States Congress, defeated 5-term incumbent Attorney General Lawrence Wasden in the May primary. Now, Mr. Arkoosh says that he has no political ambitions, but simply wants an Attorney General's office that is run ethically and competently. He's a 4th-generation Idahoan with 44 years of legal experience. He graduated from Harvard University with the Bachelor of Arts in Government and Economics and received his law degree from the University of Idaho College of Law. And Tom Arkoosh joins us now here this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My first question for you, why are you running for Attorney General?
Well, I was asked to, but the real question is, why did I accept? I accepted because, as you've indicated in your introduction, I'm a 4th-generation Idahoan. And when I was asked, I started looking into my opponent. And my opponent begins every talk with, he is going to protect freedoms and instill Idaho values. And when you look at what he's really talking about and what the party's really talking about is banning books and controlling things like free speech in terms of critical race theory or informing people about abortions. This is also the fellow that said that no one dies from access to health care. And so those kind of things pretty much impinged upon my idea of the ability of Idahoans and the right of Idahoans to be left alone. I would hear flowery words, but it didn't look very good underneath. So I accepted the opportunity to run.
And you accepted the opportunity to run as a Democrat, and I know there's been a lot of talk about this in the media, and your opponent has brought this up. You were recently registered as a Republican. You switched over now. You're a Democrat, of course, to run. Why did you make that switch over, and I guess how would you explain that to people that might not understand, the flipping of political parties?
The structure of the race was such that I was unaffiliated my whole life. And when the Republican primary came up, it's a closed primary, and I wanted to vote in that primary because there were people I wanted to vote against, including my opponent. And when Lawrence Wasden didn't win, and then the Democrat Party came to me and said, there is a place here to run, and then I investigated my opponent and decided to accept that, it was necessary to register as a Democrat in order to run and supplant the then placeholder, Steve Scanlon.
Would you, I guess, view yourself as a Democrat politically? I guess, where do you line up, or is this kind of just the conveniency of, okay, you have to be with the party to run?
I have read both platforms, and I have to say that the Democrat platform is more humane and aligns really with what Idaho values are: education, health care, human rights, that type of thing. The Republican platform goes on for about 20 pages talking about trickle-down economics and talking about how we're going to control people. And it bothers me. So do I identify as a Democrat? Yes. I've registered as a Democrat, and I am running as a Democrat.
There's been a lot of talk in this race about what the role of the Attorney General will be, and we've heard from the community on both sides of the aisle the worries about an activist Attorney General or an Attorney General that would overstep the traditional bounds of the job. What is your view of being Attorney General in Idaho? How far do you think the power goes?
That's an interesting question. How far the power goes or how far the power should go. The Attorney General's office is a law office, and having practiced law for 44 years, I know what a law office does. It takes the statutes, the federal and state constitutions, and it applies those to the facts before it. My opponent does not really see this as a law office. He's been very clear it's an activist political office. And then it transmutes that office from a law office, applying the law, into a policy office. And I think that's a bridge too far, because his policies, in my view, are not Idaho values. They're cultural policies that can change from day to day. I would rather stick with the law and the rule of law and leave the cultural or policy matters to the legislature and the governor's office.
There's been a lot of conversation in this race, of course, about Idaho's changing abortion laws. Of course, you've spoken out publicly about it. Your opponent, Mr. Labrador, very strong comments as well. For folks that might have not followed your comments and your thoughts through the race, what are your thoughts of Idaho's abortion laws as they stand right now? Of course, there's the 3 laws. Most notably nationwide is that trigger ban, which essentially outlaws all abortions except for in cases of rape, incest, or when it's reported to law enforcement in that way.
So, there are 2 issues in your question. There are 3 laws. The first is the heartbeat law, which probably was supplanted by the absolute ban and the trigger law with the 3 exceptions you mentioned. Those laws are currently before the Supreme Court. But what the Supreme Court says regarding whether there's a right of privacy or how those laws are to be enforced, that's what the Attorney General needs to do. Now, there's one exception, and that's a woman's health care. There is a federal law that supplants the state law concerning health care. The exception we have for health care is if you're going to treat the woman to save her life. The federal law says you must treat the woman if her health is in jeopardy, and Judge Windmill has ruled that that supplants the state law. I support that ruling, and I think it's legally correct in terms of ethics and humanitarianism. It has to be correct.
Yeah, at this point, it's in the hands of the Supreme Court and also the federal court at the federal level. In terms of a decision, what they will make, we're not sure. What are your thoughts on what decision they should make? Do you think Idaho's laws are written legally, or do you have legal concerns on the way the legislature passed laws and now we know they're in the Supreme Court?
Regarding the health care law, I think the federal law supplants the state law, and I think Judge Windmill is right. Regarding the determination of non-health care abortion, again, that's up to the Supreme Court, and it should be enforced by the Attorney General's office if they make a determination that is constitutional under the United States Constitution. And since the Dobbs decision, that's been turned back to our state Supreme Court. That's what the Attorney General should enforce.
Your opponent has made, I guess, accusations or comments to imply or say straight out that, you will likely do what you want to do and that you would not be willing to work with the legislature or the Republican-controlled state government. What is your reaction to comments that you wouldn't play nice or work well with Republican-controlled state house?
Well, that is the oldest political trick in the book, I am told, having been a politician now for all of maybe 3.5 months. You labeled your opponent with your weakness. I've been very clear that I'm willing to follow the law and represent the entirety of the legislature. My opponent has been very clear that he will use that office aggressively to advance his cultural views, and he will partner with some of the legislators. He's said that he will partner with what he calls conservative legislators, I guess abandoning the rest. And I think what he means is that he's going to partner with the extremist group in the Republican Party. I know that's what he means.
And I know that, there's been supporters of yours that have spoken out about extremism in politics and fighting back on extremism. And, talking to your supporters, it's one of the reasons they encouraged you to run. What are your thoughts on extremism in state politics? Do you think there is extremism, or do you think this is a buzzword?
Well, when you talk about arresting librarians who publish nothing but just put books on a shelf and catalog them, which was a bill last year, and when you talk about arresting doctors for providing standard of care, health care to women, and then telling them, well, we're going to give you a chance to prove your innocence once we've charged you with a felony, I don't think extremism is a buzzword, and my opponent supports both of those positions. So extremism is real in Idaho politics, and I think it's going to be advanced significantly when my opponent says that he's going to use the Attorney General's office for an aggressive cultural office.
We're sitting down this morning on Viewpoint with Idaho Attorney General candidate Tom Arkoosh. We are going to step aside, but when we come back, we're going to get more into the big topics. Plus, we're going to learn a little bit more about Mr. Arkoosh. Viewpoint returns right after this.
From Idaho's News Channel 7, this is Viewpoint.
And welcome back to Viewpoint this morning. Thank you for joining us. As we head towards the November 8th election, we are talking about some of the major races, including the race for Idaho Attorney General. And joining me here this morning, Democrat candidate Tom Arkoosh. And Mr. Arkoosh, as we were going to break, we were talking about working with the legislature and kind of the relationship between the Attorney General's office and the Attorney General. But my question for you, your opponent, Raul Labrador, said, quote, "You've already lost the trust of the legislature." Do you think you've lost the trust of the legislature, or maybe just a portion of it? I guess how do you reconcile that heading into having to work with them possibly at a very significant point of work?
Well, I'm not really sure what he meant by that. Lost the trust of the legislature. The statutory duty of the Attorney General's office is to advise. One of the statutory duties is to advise the legislature and to write opinions and treat the legislature as it is, which is a client. Now, if some people in the legislature want to propound unconstitutional views and ignore the opinion of the Attorney General, I don't think I've lost their trust. They just have a different view of constitutional law, and that's cost us a lot of money recently, propounding in court some laws that on their face look patently unconstitutional. I mean, like the last two lawsuits we went in, we had to pay the other side that we were so unfounded in the approach. So does that mean I lose their trust? No. Will some legislators, notwithstanding the obligation of the Attorney General to be their lawyer, have different legal views than I might have? That's certainly possible.
There's been a lot of talk in recent years about the Attorney General's office and their dealing with the Idaho legislature. You just referred to the Constitutional Defense Fund. Looking back, a number of years, what are your thoughts on how the Attorney General's office currently is handling its relationship with the legislature? It sounds like you would probably do it differently.
Well, I'd like to talk. I've been a mediator in my practice. I've settled more cases than I've tried. I've tried a lot of cases, but I've settled more. And I think it's to everybody's advantage, even if you're in an adversarial position with somebody, or even if your client does not understand or agree with you, to sit down and talk it through. And that's my offer. If somebody doesn't want to talk, I can't fix that. But if somebody is interested in talking, I'm your man.
There's a situation where if you're elected Attorney General, you're not by yourself in there. You have a whole office full of lawyers, and the truth is that in private practice across the state and really across the Northwest, top lawyers can make a lot more money working in private practice than they would be working for the Attorney General's office. With that said, what would your plan be to staff the AG's office with the best lawyers possible in order to, I guess, push through what you would say as having conversations and not just chasing legal action?
So I've met a lot of deputy AGs. For that matter, I tried a case against a deputy AG last month, and he was a very good lawyer. He was a young man. He tried a good case. So I think it's well-staffed currently. The people there, I find, are there not for economics, but for public service, and it really draws some really sharp legal minds. That's been my experience with how Lawrence Wasden has run the office. My concern is my opponent has vowed to pretty much clean out that office, if I understand what he's saying, and if you don't agree with his agenda, you're gone for sure. Well, that's not how you treat public service people. You treat them as professionals. If they have a different opinion, you sit down and listen to it and take advantage of it if you can. That's how you run a law office.
So as we established, you've worked as 44 years as a legal professional. So let's ask you a legal question. And this is something that I think the Idaho legislature is going to talk a lot about this year as they did last year. vouchers and education. Now, there are some that have pushed for the idea of funding students, not systems, and they want to be able to have a voucher system that would allow money to follow students to wherever educational opportunity that they choose, and that could be private school, that could be religious school. There are some that says that these vouchers would be against the law, against the Idaho Constitution, having public money go to private institutions. There are others that say it would be appropriate because, you know, there would be a situation where we're supporting the students and it really wouldn't break any laws. What are your thoughts on the education voucher conversation, something that, again, I think will be very big this year?
Well, you have to start that conversation with what's in the state constitution. What's in the state constitution, we have promised every child of school age in this state a thorough and uniform free education. Where we are on that right now is far behind. The Office of Performance Review, which is the fact finder for the legislature, found that we're $851 million short in 77 of the 115 school districts and just having good facilities, not excellent facilities, but facilities that hopefully are safe for our children. That is, according to the Supreme Court, that funding obligation is an obligation of the state of Idaho. So that purse needs to be filled, I would think, before we even, and that's not a legal issue, it's a fiscal issue, should be filled before we start talking about vouchers. Now, there is the Blaine Amendment in our Constitution that says if you fund, we cannot fund religious private schools. The United States Supreme Court says if you fund private schools, you must fund religious schools, so there's a conflict there. Now, what Montana did is they funded only private schools, and the Supreme Court struck that down. So it's going to depend legally a lot on how ultimately that bill comes out, if it comes out.
A topic at the Attorney General's office right now is about scam awareness and really business protections. And I've spoken to Idahoans that say under AG Wasden, they really like the news pieces that the office puts out. They really like the helpful tips that, you know, they put out. And this seems to be something that is very, you know, a passion project for Wasden. For you, would you have a passion project or an area of emphasis that would be unique to you? Sometimes we see federal, I should say, state office holders have something that they say, okay, I'm really going to focus in on this. This is something important to me. Is there something in the AG's office that interests you outside of, you know, the major big social topics?
There are two things. One is his consumer protection, and I would love to build on that. He has done a marvelous job. He's collected, since he's been there, he's collected $750 million from opioid dealers and tobacco companies and people who are affecting our health. My opponent has said he's going to deconstruct that program, and he's going to have a one-on-one rather than going after large corporations, which looks to me like retail campaigning for his next office. The other project that we've got to solve in this state is the water budget in the Snake River Plain. and to some extent in the Boise, we came out really good in the Treasure Valley this year, but the Snake River Plain ended in drought. And so what I've proposed to do, given my litigation experience in water, which is extensive, is, and I know the players, I would like to have a conversation to see if we can do something like they did in the Yakima, have a long-term plan to do something about the water budget.
We touched on this at the beginning of the show, but you've never run for political office. You admit that you're not a political person inherently. Why now, in 2022, when the world in Idaho is, you know, arguably more politically charged than ever? Why get into this now?
Well, as I indicated, it is more politically charged than ever, and the standard for me, ultimately, is the right to be left alone. And I know that my opponent talks about the Idaho values and freedoms and all of those things, but as I indicated at the top of this show, when you look at what he's talking about that cultural extremism that reaches into our libraries, reaches into our bedrooms, reaches into our schoolrooms, mutes what people can say, thwarts the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution, and on and on and on. That's why I'm here.
Outside of politics, outside of law, what interests you? What makes Tom Arkoosh tick? I know that a lot of people are likely meeting you for the first time as you travel across the state.
I'm a pretty average guy. I mean, I grew up on a farm. I have a lot of outdoor interests, and I have a lot of indoor interests. I like to read, and I like frankly, I like to cook. I love to cook. It's really not a lot to do with the Attorney General's office, but it's something I like to do.
I'm always curious when you have people running for major office, possible leaders of our state. Where do you see Idaho going in the next few years?
Well, I am hopeful for this campaign, and I'm hopeful for the state of Idaho, that the values I hold, the right to be left alone, fiscal conservatism, are the values of the grand old party and of the Democrat Party. And I distinguish the grand old party from the extremists that I'm seeing in the Republican Party today. So there's a group of us in the middle that I hope can recapture the soul of Idaho, that we stop fighting and we start talking. My bet in this campaign is there's more people that want to talk and accomplish and fill potholes than there are people who want to reach into our bedrooms and interfere with health care and tell us we can't say certain things.
I'm curious what you've learned through the last several months, really, I guess since the end of July. Like, is there been some major takeaways, or is this kind of gone maybe the way you thought it would go?
Well, I've learned everything that I know. I had no preconception. I'm disappointed in representations that people are willing to make about themselves and others, but I suppose that's the nature of politics and maybe why I've always been unaffiliated. I've learned this, though. When I had 50 stalwart Republicans come out for me, there's courage left in this state. There's a lot of courage left in this state. And if we just screw our courage to the sticking point, to quote a cliche, we're going to be okay. But if we continue not to talk and we continue to vilify the other side rather than recognize their differences that need to be worked through, we're going to continue with our problems. But I will repeat again, if we adhere to the right to be left alone and we continue to talk, I have faith we're going to be all right.
Real quickly before we wrap up, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the, I would say, significant amount of Republicans that have come out to vocally support you. There are people that say that these are Republicans that are retired or on their way out of office. There are others that say this is a major moment where you have longtime Republicans like Lori Otter, endorsing a Democrat. What are your thoughts on that?
When you take somebody like Lori Otter or Senator Lodge, who have never voted for a Democrat in their life, they're seeing exactly what I talked about in the last answer. We've got to meet in the middle. And my opponent promises the exacerbation of extremism. That's his promise. I promise to talk. I promise to be in the middle. I promise to adhere to the right to be left alone, and I promise to keep that office as a law office and not as a cultural war room where my views are the views that are propounded.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here this Sunday morning on Viewpoint. Our guest this week, Tom Arkoosh. We're going to wrap up, but again, Mr. Arkoosh, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be following the election as we get closer to November 8th. All right, Viewpoint returns right after this. And thank you so much for joining us here on Viewpoint this morning. We'll be following all the action as we head closer to the November general election coming up again on November 8th. If you have any questions about what's on your ballot or how you can vote, you can go to our website right now, KTVB.com, and check out our voter guide. There you'll be able to track all the races in your neighborhood and beyond, as well as prepare for anything you need to know about, again, ahead of November 8th. We'll see you next Sunday morning right here on Viewpoint. For now, though, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great week as we track the end of the road to the election here on KTVB.